You're now watching Sports Bettor's Paradise on the Bet Rivers Network.
All right, Jimmy, Ott and Paul Stone, and I'm still in Las Vegas. Paul Stone's back in Texas, but he was with me. That's right. We were poolside during the show, and glad to get back a full week, that extended 5-day extended weekend for the first full weekend of college football. A lot to take in, but let's get right to the main matchup this week. And we were talking about this one be way back in the summer. So the defending national champions, the Michigan Wolverines, and sort of pedestrian in their opening week game. They won, but failed to cover against Fresno State in the yardstick. You know, the box score, it was kind of indicative of that. It was a bit of a struggle for the Michigan Wolverines. So Texas, not so much the case. We thought they might be looking ahead a little bit, but they just smashed Colorado State 52-0. So that line that was at 3 when we did the college football games of the year, it's jumped up to 6.5 on the recency bias. Paul, is that too much of an adjustment by the odds makers? Right now at Bet Rivers, it's 6.5, 44.5.
Yeah, I'm not really to jump in just quite yet, Jimmy, on Michigan, but I think it's a little bit of an overreaction. Obviously Michigan, as you mentioned, a lackluster opening game performance, and Sharon Moore's head coaching debut there scored 2 touchdowns in the final 6 minutes to account for the final of 30-10, one of those being an 86-yard interception return for touchdown. But we knew coming in, they were replacing a lot of people. Jim Harbaugh, the head coach, obviously off to the NFL. J.J. McCarthy, a top draft pick. In fact, I think they had 13 people, a school record, drafted in this past spring's NFL draft.
It was.
And a number of those went in I think they had 7 in the first 85 picks, something like that. So a lot of good players out the door. To the naked eye, when you look at this game and kind of start your handicap, I think a lot of people, especially kind of novices, for lack of a better term, are going to look at the Longhorns. They look at that big victory over Colorado State. They look at the fact that Michigan struggled in their opener against Fresno State. But this game's in the big house, and funny things happen on the road, and the home team is in their comfort zone. I think Michigan's going to try to establish the run game. They didn't run the football very well at all against Fresno State on Saturday, but they're going to try to establish the run game, play great defense, shorten the football game, and perhaps win that turnover battle. If this game hits 7, I'm going to take the Wolverines, and I would recommend the same for the listeners.
They did outrush Fresno State 148-9 in that one, but only outgained the Bulldogs by 25. First downs were exactly the same at 18, and maybe Michigan's hoping that they finish stronger, because 17 of the 30 points they scored were in the fourth quarter to put the game away, because it was very, very, very competitive for quite some time. This is a recency bias at its best for both teams here. Texas wins and covers comfortably, and Michigan struggles. Week 1 to week 2, what's real and what is an overreaction? You make your biggest jump from game 1 to game 2 in college football. But to move from 3.5, from 3, there were actually some 2.5s that you saw back in the summer at different places. To go from 2.5, 3 to 6.5, I just think there's some value right there. I like to be the contrarian when it comes to recency bias, and that's what I'm doing right here. 6.5 at home in the big house. They're excited that Texas is coming to town too. So they'll have 100,000 excited Wolverine fans looking to take a little value, inflated line in that 6.5. Paul, do you think it'll go to 7?
That's a good question, kind of the $64,000 question. I think it might go to 7, but I'll say this, with quite a bit of experience, and I've been wrong before and will be wrong again, but if it hits 7, the sharps are going to come in heavy and offer that resistance, and it's going to push back to 6.5 pretty quick. I don't think it's going to get to 7 and stay to 7, but I think there's a possibility it gets to 7. And if you're, watching the screen and an opportunist, you might be able to get that 7 if it shows up.
All right, Iowa State. This is always an underfest. It's been cashing those under bets, and who better than Iowa to be an under team? But especially this game, 2.5, 35.5 at Iowa City. So the suspension of game 1 and a slow start, but once they got going a little bit, now it was some defensive scores as well for Iowa, but a key game early in this with this in-state rival at Iowa City. So the Hawkeyes 2.5, 35.5 at home against the Cyclones.
Yeah, this game's gone under 5 straight years, Jimmy. 2019 through, or actually 2018 through 2023. They didn't play in 2020 due to the pandemic, but only the last two has the total closed in the 30s. So that's important to note. Back in 2018, 2021, and 2019, it closed in the 40s. Closed at 39.5 in 2022, and then 36 last year. You've got to look at the under here. I think I'm going to wait and kind of see what it does. I'm not ready to recommend it just yet. But you look at this Iowa team. They've got Michigan transfer Cade McNamara at quarterback. They've got a new offensive coordinator in Tim Lester. Hoping to add some fuel to an offense that's only averaged 15.1 points per game against Power 4 opponents over the last 2 seasons in 23 games. So they have not been very offensive. I was a little surprised at Iowa State's showing in its opener against FCS North Dakota, not to be confused with North Dakota State. Iowa State's a very experienced football team on both sides of the ball, but they struggled a little bit there in that opener. But like you said, sometimes week 1 to week 2, there's a lot of progression, a lot of improvement by teams. So no big opinion here, but certainly can't fault the person for riding that under train until it goes off the rails.
I got to believe that, yeah, my lean is toward the under at 35.5 right now. And I think that's kind of maybe a high point. I think and look, McNamara is certainly better than the guys that were backing up last year. So he had a solid game, and he's not bad, not at all. But he's not the only piece that needs some fixing, with that Iowa offense. But, they did finish stronger in their 40-0 win. He was fine, 21-29, 3 TDs, no interceptions. So something of a hope, but still, in this game, they're fine. Punt's fine with Iowa State. And I think it's going to go under 35.5, and I think that line is going to go down as well. I was at a neutral site game where it might have been 60-40 LSU USC, but it was a great neutral site atmosphere. The fans were into it, and I think you're going to have something like this in Charlotte this weekend. The Tennessee Volunteers, they are excited about their quarterback. There's no doubt about that. And boy, he was sharp in the first game in their big win there. 780 yards of offense for the Volunteers. So what's happened? NC State struggled. Was that game straight up was in doubt in their first one against Western Carolina. So Tennessee, it's gone from 4.5 to 7.5 after these results this past Saturday. 59.5 is the total.
Yeah, we've talked about it already on this podcast. As college football handicappers, it's very important not to overreact to week 1 or any individual week for that matter. You kind of have to keep it in perspective. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't pump the brakes a little bit on North Carolina State. I mean, I was one of the people who had very optimistic outlook for the Wolfpack entering the season, and they're 1-0, so they could still meet all their goals. But that's a little bit concerning. They actually trailed Western Carolina early in the fourth quarter, erupted for 21 fourth quarter points, and won that game 38-21, but a very misleading final score. I don't know if we found out a whole lot about Tennessee. We knew they were very prolific offensively, got a great core of receivers, and their big-time 5-star quarterback, Nico Iamaleava. I'm going to work on that and get that down, but I think I was pretty close there in my.
It's just Nico, baby. That's it.
Nico's easier, but I'm going to master that pronunciation. Tennessee, Chattanooga as they go by now, completely outmanned. They weren't able to put up a whole lot of resistance. Grayson McCall, that was his first start. North Carolina State's new quarterback who comes over from Coastal Carolina. Of the Sun Belt Conference. He actually started 41 games at Coastal, so he's a guy now with 42 collegiate starts under his belt, and he'll be better in game 2 than he was game 1. Tennessee, I know, opened at 6 on Sunday at some books, now up to 7.5, and I would like to get on Tennessee. If it comes back down, I'll probably take Tennessee if it gets back to 6, but at 7.5, that's just too many points. I think North Carolina State's going to make a better account of themselves in week 2.
I think that both offenses are going to be just fine in this one, and I like the over 59.5. So tons of and Tennessee likes to run tempo also, so it's a big part of what Josh Heupel does in Knoxville. And I thought Grayson McCall was fine. He was. They were moving the ball a little bit more of his legs. He only rushed for 15 yards. He's a little bit more dual threat than we've seen, but over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. So with his new team, they moved the ball. Problem was their defense. Western Carolina moved the ball a lot on that one. So maybe a shootout here in Charlotte. They'll split the tickets 50-50, and that'll be a cool atmosphere between Tennessee and NC State. I do agree. I mean, it was just 4.5 right before these two results. Is that an overreaction? Probably so. But I don't think you're going to get you seven flat or even under than that one. I think that this line is pushed up for a reason because they anticipate the recency bias with Tennessee, looking much better than NC State in their first game. All right, rematch here, Nebraska, Colorado. Nebraska was kind of got out the gates a little slow, but let's not overreact to ugly offensive football in week 1. This was a game that Nebraska was favored last year when they went to Boulder, and Colorado showed a little defense in that game. We all expected Matt Rule in this year to kind of make a little bit of a jump. Nebraska at home in Lincoln, 7.5 and 57.5.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy, there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm surrounding this Nebraska program as we enter 2024. And that enthusiasm certainly wasn't dampened by their season opening easy victory over outclassed UTEP. I certainly don't discount the thought of the Cornhuskers starting the season 7-0. They're going to be favored in their first 7 games. This is an improved football team. The schedule sets up beautifully. But, a few things to keep in mind here. First of all, UTEP, they're one of the 10 worst teams in the entire 134-team FBS, in my opinion. So a lot of times I like to say it's not how you play, it's who you play. So certainly I think UTEP had a little bit to do with that season opening, convincing victory, obviously. And also you look at this Nebraska team, they hadn't had a winning season or been to a bowl in any of the previous 7 seasons. So you got to, take into account where they've been recently. And as part of that recent futility, they're only 11-33 straight up against Power 4 teams in their last 44 games. So Matt Rule certainly hadn't been around for much of that, but you still have to take those things into account. So again, let's pump the brakes a little bit here on Nebraska. Nebraska opened as little as a 5-point favorite in this game against Colorado yesterday on Sunday. So all the money pretty much has been on the Cornhuskers. And a lot of people, to me, they're just acting like, I've heard a lot of commentary on it, and I'm not saying the Buffaloes look great, but people are acting like Colorado just stunk up the joint Thursday against North Dakota State. That's a good North Dakota State football team, an FCS team that's won a few national championships at that level, and they were a very game opponent. So they beat a pretty good football team. And you look at this game last year between Colorado and Nebraska. Colorado put up 454 yards, which was the most Nebraska allowed to any opponent last year, and they gave up 396 yards through the air. And in my opinion, Colorado's passing game is even better this year than last. I think the number is in our favor here. I think 7.5 points is too many points. I think there's a chance that Nebraska even wins this game outright, or Colorado rather, wins this game outright. I like the Buffaloes plus 7.5 over the Cornhuskers Saturday in Lincoln.
All right, Paul Stone on the Buffaloes taking the points in Lincoln. A couple of old Big 8 representatives back in one year. I remember when they played in Colorado. I think it was Lawrence Phillips ripped off an option for about 50, 60 yards to set the tone that one. So Colorado, and still some head-scratching game management from Coach Prime as well. He just kind of doesn't get it. So anyway, in our last game that we were talking about this week, I remember when LeGarrette Blount was throwing helmets and punching people when the Boise State back in the day. Boise State, not quite what they were at that point. They were in a shootout in week one. My goodness, that was up and down the field, scoring close to 100 points. The Ducks, only 24 points. They said, wait, what's happening? This is a team that's one of the biggest favorites to make it to the playoff this year. Oregon, they did have 487 total yards. Dylan Gabriel, a lot of underneath stuff, 41 to 49 for 380 and 3 TDs. So Oregon, back home, 18 and a half and 60 and a half over the visiting Broncos.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jimmy, this line 18 and a half there at Bet Rivers. And before last Saturday's openers for both teams, I had this line at 22 and a half. So I think we've got some value here. I think that's what it would have opened over 3 touchdowns. I think either 22 and a half, maybe 23. And again, as you indicated, Oregon's season opening 24-14 victory over Idaho certainly raised some eyebrows, and I might add, deservedly so. It wasn't a sharp showing by the Ducks. They only led 17-14 with under 10 minutes remaining. They were favored by 44 and a half points. So you kind of got to give them. I'm not going to give them a total mulligan here, so to speak, but I'm going to give them a little bit of a mulligan. They did win the total yardage battle, 487 to 217. That was Dylan Gabriel. That was his first start for Oregon. Comes over most recently from Oklahoma. So this will be his second game as an Oregon Duck against Boise on Saturday. And again, Oregon, we can talk about it all day long. They certainly didn't bring their A game, so it is what it is. But it's also fair to say Boise's defense certainly left something to be desired as well. They played Georgia Southern. Georgia Southern finishes with 461 total yards, actually led that game 37 to 36 over Boise 90 seconds into the fourth quarter. So Georgia Southern had a lead there for a brief period of time in the fourth. If you include going back to last year's bowl game for Boise against UCLA, if you count that game, a 35 to 22 loss to UCLA to end last season, Boise has now allowed a total of 80 points and 971 yards in its last 2 games against UCLA and Georgia Southern. I think Oregon's going to, bring a little bit more moxie to the table on Saturday. That was a lackluster showing. I'm sure Dan Lanning's going to remind his troops of that showing. I'm sure the offense, which prides itself on being a really high-octane unit, is going to want to pile up some points on the Broncos. And also Boise, something to point out, they'll be traveling, not a real long trip, but they'll be traveling for the second straight Saturday. They went mostly across the country to Statesboro, Georgia this past weekend to play Georgia Southern. Now they go up to Eugene, Oregon to play the Ducks. So put it all together, I think Boise State, I think we're buying low here. I'll take I say Boise State. I'll take the Ducks, the Oregon Ducks, minus 18 and a half over Boise State.
All right, I like that. It's that Boise State Georgia Southern game, over 1,000 yards of combined offense between those two schools. 651 for the Broncos, 461 for Georgia Southern. So it was just up and down the field, and the running back had an unreal day. Janty had 267 and 6 TDs for the Broncos, but Oregon, don't overreact to some ugly football in week one. We think there's way too many pieces in place to make a run. So the Oregon. And speaking of which, Paul, is anybody more impressive than Georgia in week one? I mean, that is an elite defense with depth, and you got an experienced, good quarterback, smart quarterback on the other side. That's going to take a lot to beat them.
Yeah, they're now 43 and 2 straight up over the last 2 seasons in one game. And, it comes down to recruiting, the way that Kirby Smart has recruited. And obviously they've developed that talent, but they're so good on defense. You know that they're going to allow less than 20 points a game on average defensively, because they really do reload at those defensive positions. And Carson Beck, this time last year, I think we all had at least some questions about how he would fit in as a quarterback of a championship caliber team. And about halfway through last year, he hit another gear, and he's one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks in all of college football, I think, by most people's estimation. They need to, I don't think, you always try to look for something even in greatness. And it's difficult to replace the production of a generational tight end like Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, the wide receiver, who was a second-round pick as well. They're going to have to find some wide receivers. I think the running game will be kind of a running game by committee, as it has been a little bit when Trevor Etienne comes back from suspension. So I think they'll straighten that out. But they're going to have to identify some receivers, and I think they will. And, man, they're kind of the team to beat until further notice. An impressive program. It's all clicking there for Kirby Smart there in Athens.
All right, for Paul Stone, I'm Jimmy Ott later on in the week. So that's the high volume games this week. Our best bets later on this week. For Paul Stone, I'm Jimmy Ott here in the Sports Bettor's Paradise on the Bet Rivers Network.